His wife was a walking death sentence. Bianca Vitali had always believed she was untouchable. But when her father lost everything, when his empire crumbled beneath him, she realized the truth: she was collateral. And the man collecting the debt was Matteo Greco. He tilted his head, watching her with dark amusement. "Your father played a dangerous game," he murmured. "Now I make the rules." Chapter 1. The Fall of the Vitali Empire. The chandelier, a glittering constellation of crystal and gold, seemed to mock Bianca Vitali with its unwavering brilliance. It had hung in the grand ballroom of their family estate for generations, a silent witness to countless celebrations, whispered secrets, and the steady, unyielding power of the Vitali name. Tonight, however, it illuminated a scene of devastation. The air, usually thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the murmur of confident voices, was heavy with a suffocating silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that suddenly felt ominous, like the countdown to an execution. Bianca stood at the edge of the now empty ballroom, her hand trembling as she traced the intricate carvings of the mahogany balustrade. Just hours ago, this room had been filled with the cream of New York society, all eager to bask in the glow of her father, Don Alessandro Vitali. The annual Vitali Charity Gala, a glittering showcase of wealth and influence, had been in full swing. Champagne had flowed, diamonds had sparkled, and the orchestra had played with a feverish energy, as if trying to drown out the whispers that had been circulating for weeks, whispers of shaky deals, of rivals circling like wolves, of the Vitali empire teetering on the brink of collapse. Bianca had dismissed those whispers as idle gossip, the envious mutterings of those who could never reach the heights of the Vitali family. Her father, after all, was invincible. He was the sun around which their world revolved, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He had built his empire from nothing, clawing his way to the top with a ruthless determination and an unwavering belief in his own power. Bianca had always believed that power was unshakable, a birthright, a shield against the harsh realities of the world. She had been wrong. The first sign of trouble had been subtle, almost imperceptible. A phone call, answered with a curt nod and a flicker of something that might have been anxiety in her father's usually impassive eyes. Then, a hurried meeting with his capos, their faces grim, their voices hushed. Bianca had tried to ask, to understand, but her father had waved her away with a dismissive, "It's nothing for you to worry about, Cara. Business as usual." But it wasn't business as usual. It was the end. The news had spread like wildfire, consuming the celebratory atmosphere in an instant. One moment, the room was buzzing with laughter and conversation. The next, it was filled with a stunned silence, broken only by the panicked whispers of those scrambling to distance themselves from the falling star. The guests, once so eager to be seen in the Vitali presence, vanished like shadows in the night, their smiles replaced with expressions of thinly veiled pity, or worse, undisguised glee. Bianca had watched them go, her heart a cold knot of dread in her chest. She had seen the fear in her mother's eyes, the lines of worry etched deep around her mouth. She had seen the way her younger brother, Leo, clung to his mother's side, his youthful bravado shattered by the sudden, inexplicable shift in their world. But it was her father's face that haunted her. The mask of invincibility had crumbled, revealing a man stripped bare, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and a chilling, resigned acceptance. He had aged 10 years in a single hour, the weight of his collapsing empire crushing him beneath its ruins. He had looked at Bianca, his gaze lingering on her face as if memorizing it, and said, "It's over, Bambina." Everything. His words echoed in the empty ballroom, bouncing off the silent walls, a stark pronouncement of their downfall. Bianca wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The warmth of the silk gown she wore, a masterpiece of emerald green that had been custom-made for tonight's event, felt like a cruel mockery. It was a reminder of the life she had known, a life of privilege and protection, a life that had vanished in the blink of an eye. She walked slowly towards the large windows that overlooked the sprawling gardens, now shrouded in darkness. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a vast, indifferent expanse that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a world she had always viewed from a distance, a world she had been taught to both fear and control. Now, she was being thrust into it, stripped of her armor, her family's name no longer a shield but a target. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, followed by another, and another, until she was weeping silently, her body shaking with the force of her grief. She grieved for the loss of her home, her security, her illusions. She grieved for her father, the once mighty lion brought low. She grieved for her own naivete, for the blind faith she had placed in a world built on shifting sands. A sound behind her, the soft click of a door closing, made her turn. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing, his presence filling the vast emptiness of the room. It was Matteo Greco. Even in the dim light, his presence radiated power, a different kind of power than her father's, less flamboyant, more contained, but undeniably potent. He moved with a quiet grace, a predator stalking its prey. His eyes, dark and intense, seemed to pierce through her, stripping away her defenses, seeing the raw, vulnerable girl beneath the carefully constructed facade of a Vitali princess. Bianca had known of Matteo Greco, of course. He was a rising force in the underworld, a man whispered about in hushed tones, a man even her father had treated with a cautious respect. He was known for his ruthlessness, his intelligence, and his unwavering loyalty to his own family, the Greco clan, a name that carried its own weight of history and blood. He was also known more recently to be the one who had outmaneuvered her father, the one holding all the cards. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze unwavering. He didn't speak, didn't offer any empty platitudes or false condolences. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, a silent observer of her unraveling. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until Bianca couldn't bear it any longer. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling, but holding a flicker of defiance. He tilted his head slightly, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "What I want," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur that sent a shiver down her spine, "is what is owed to me." His gaze swept over her, taking in her tear-stained face, her trembling hands, the vulnerability that she could no longer conceal. He was assessing her, not as a woman, but as an asset, a piece of property to be claimed. He moved closer, his shadow falling over her, and Bianca felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct to flee. But she stood her ground, her pride, the last vestige of her Vitali heritage, refusing to let her cower. Then he spoke, each word delivered with the quiet certainty of a man who held all the power, a man accustomed to getting his way. "Your father played a dangerous game," he murmured, his dark eyes locking with hers. "Now, I make the rules." His words were like a physical blow, forcing the air from her lungs. What game? What rules? Bianca's mind struggled to grasp the reality. What are you talking about? He came even closer, a subtle scent of sandalwood and something darker, more primal, filled her senses. Your father, in his desperation, made certain agreements. Pledges. She raised her chin, fighting to keep her fear at bay. I know nothing of these agreements. Matteo's dark eyes, almost black in the dim light of the ballroom, were now just inches from her own. You will, he stated, with no trace of doubt. A chilling confidence, a quiet command. She felt the cold weight of his words settle over her, a suffocating blanket of inevitability. What had her father done? What terrible price was she now expected to pay? Chapter 2. Debts written in blood. The silence that followed Matteo's pronouncement was thick with unspoken implications. Bianca felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a premonition of a future she couldn't yet comprehend, but knew instinctively was irrevocably altered. The grand ballroom, once a symbol of her family's power, now felt like a mausoleum, a monument to their shattered dreams. Matteo remained close, his presence a palpable force, a constant reminder of the debt that hung over her, a debt she hadn't incurred, but was now bound to repay. His proximity was both intimidating and strangely captivating. She found herself studying him, trying to decipher the enigma behind his dark eyes, the subtle curve of his lips that hinted at both cruelty and a hidden vulnerability. He was a man of contradictions, a predator who moved with the grace of a dancer, a whisper of danger wrapped in an allure she couldn't deny. He was impeccably dressed, as always, in a tailored suit that seemed to mold to his powerful frame. The fabric was dark, almost black, contrasting sharply with the crisp white of his shirt. A single, understated gold chain glinted at his throat, a subtle reminder of his wealth and power. He exuded an aura of control, of a man who was used to being obeyed, a man who knew his own strength and wielded it with a quiet, almost effortless confidence. "Tell me," Bianca said, her voice barely a whisper, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and a strange, defiant curiosity. "Tell me what my father did." Matteo's gaze didn't waver. He held her eyes captive, drawing her into a world of shadows and secrets, a world where the rules were different, where loyalty and betrayal were intertwined, where life and death were often separated by a single, whispered word. "He borrowed," Matteo said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them.
"A considerable sum."
From sources that are not known for their patience. Bianca knew what he meant. Her father had always walked a tightrope between the legitimate world of business and the shadowy underbelly of the city, a world ruled by families like the Vitalas and the Grecos, a world where debts were paid not just in money, but in blood. And he couldn't repay it? She asked, the question a mere formality. She already knew the answer. The speed of their downfall, the panicked exodus of their so-called friends, the despair in her father's eyes, it all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Matteo inclined his head, a gesture that was both an acknowledgement and a subtle assertion of his own power.
"He made promises," he said. "Promises he couldn't keep."
He offered collateral. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Collateral. Bianca felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard the word used before, in hushed conversations between her father and his capos, in the coded language of their world. It was a word that spoke of desperate measures, of risks taken and lost, of the ultimate price of failure. "What collateral?" she asked, her voice trembling, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She braced herself for the answer, knowing that it would change her life forever. Matteo's gaze shifted, moving from her face to the empty ballroom, to the remnants of the shattered gala, to the ghosts of the life that had been ripped away from her. He seemed to be weighing his words, choosing them carefully, as if he were crafting a sentence, not just of words, but of fate. Then, he looked back at her, his eyes dark and unyielding, and delivered the blow. "You," he said, the word a single, sharp syllable that pierced through her like a blade. "He offered you." Bianca stared at him, her mind reeling, unable to comprehend the full weight of his words. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a sense of disbelief so profound that it bordered on madness. Her father, her protector, the man who had always shielded her from the harsh realities of their world, had offered her up as collateral? To settle a debt? To this man? "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her voice choked with emotion. "That's not possible." He couldn't. Matteo's expression didn't change. He remained calm, impassive, a silent witness to her denial. "He did," he said, his voice devoid of any trace of sympathy or remorse. "It's all there, in black and white. Signed, sealed, and witnessed." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document, its edges crisp and new. He held it out to her, but she didn't take it. She couldn't bring herself to touch it, to acknowledge the reality of her father's betrayal, the cold, hard truth of her own predicament. "I don't believe you," she said, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a desperate hope that this was all a nightmare, a cruel joke, a misunderstanding that could be rectified. Matteo's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It doesn't matter whether you believe me or not, Bianca. The debt is real. The agreement is binding. And I intend to collect. His words were like a death knell, tolling the end of her innocence, the end of her freedom. She was trapped, caught in a web of her father's making, a pawn in a game she didn't understand, a prize to be claimed by a man she both feared and found herself inexplicably drawn to. What does that mean? She asked, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his, desperately seeking some sign of mercy, some flicker of humanity in his cold, calculating gaze. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming her, his scent filling her senses, a mixture of danger and allure that made her head spin. It means, he said, his voice a low whisper that sent a shiver down her spine, that you belong to me now, Bianca, until the debt is repaid. Or until I decide otherwise. He reached out and gently cupped her face with one hand, his long fingers running lightly along the curve of her cheek. His touch was gentle, surprisingly so, in contrast to the steel behind his words. Don't worry. I don't make a habit of mistreating my acquisitions. His thumb brushed across her lower lip, and an unexpected tremor ran through her body. It was not entirely unpleasant. It was a current of something she hadn't felt before, a volatile mix of fear and something else. Something she didn't dare name. What would he do with her? Where would he take her? The questions swirled, unanswered, a storm brewing on the horizon of her now uncertain future. Chapter 3. The Devil's Bargain. The weight of Matteo's words, "You belong to me now," pressed down on Bianca, suffocating her with their finality. The gentle touch of his hand on her face, a stark contrast to the harshness of his claim, only served to amplify the confusion and fear swirling within her. She felt like a trapped animal, caught in a snare from which there was no escape. She pulled away from his touch, a flicker of defiance sparking in her eyes. I belong to no one, she said, her voice stronger now, fueled by a surge of anger, a refusal to be reduced to a mere possession. My father, he had no right. Matteo's expression remained unchanged, his dark eyes watching her with an unsettling calm. He had every right, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He made a choice. He offered you as collateral, and I accepted. That's the way of our world, Bianca. You know that.
She did know that.
She had grown up surrounded by the unspoken rules, the intricate web of obligations and betrayals that governed their lives. But she had always believed she was exempt, protected by her father's power, shielded from the harsh realities that lay beneath the glittering surface of their world. But I didn't agree to this, she protested, her voice laced with desperation. I had no say in it. Matteo shrugged, a slight movement of his broad shoulders that conveyed a complete lack of concern for her feelings. Your consent is irrelevant, he said. The agreement is between your father and me. You are merely the object of the transaction. The coldness of his words, the utter disregard for her as a person, fueled her anger. She took a step closer to him, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and fear. I am not an object, she said, her voice trembling with the force of her emotion. I am a woman, a person with my own thoughts, my own feelings, my own life. You can't just take me. A flicker of something that might have been amusement crossed Matteo's face. He seemed to be enjoying her defiance, her refusal to submit to his will. I can, he said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. And I will. Unless he paused, letting the word hang in the air, a tantalizing hint of a possibility, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had enveloped her. Unless what? Bianca asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Matteo's gaze swept over her, taking in her defiant stance, the fire in her eyes, the trembling vulnerability that she couldn't quite conceal. He seemed to be assessing her, weighing her worth, calculating the value of her resistance. Unless, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, you can find a way to repay the debt yourself. The words hit her like a physical blow. Repay the debt?
How?
The sum her father had borrowed was astronomical, a figure that was beyond her reach, beyond the reach of anyone she knew, now that their family's fortune had evaporated. "That's impossible," she said, her voice laced with despair. "You know it is." Matteo's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile.
"Perhaps," he said.
"But I'm a reasonable man, Bianca. I'm willing to consider alternatives." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming her, his scent filling her senses. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers brushing against her skin, sending a jolt of electricity through her. "What kind of alternatives?" she asked, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his, desperately seeking some clue, some hint of what he was thinking. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear, his voice a low, seductive murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. "We could come to an arrangement," he said. "A different kind of agreement. One that would be mutually beneficial." His words were veiled, ambiguous, but the underlying meaning was clear. He was offering her a bargain, a devil's bargain, a chance to buy her freedom, not with money, but with something far more personal. Bianca felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. Fear, revulsion, a strange, unsettling excitement. She was repelled by the idea of being used, of becoming a pawn in his game, but she was also drawn to the challenge, to the possibility of outsmarting him, of finding a way to regain control of her life. She looked at him, her eyes narrowed, her mind racing, trying to decipher his motives, to understand the trap he was setting for her. He was a dangerous man, a predator, but he was also intriguing. There was a darkness in him, a shadow that both frightened and fascinated her. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. Matteo's smile widened, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that revealed a hint of teeth, a flash of something predatory. "I'm suggesting," he said, his voice a low, seductive purr, "that we explore the possibilities. That we see if we can find a way to satisfy both our needs." He lifted a hand and lightly traced the line of her jaw, the touch feather light, yet loaded with a potent energy. Bianca held her breath, her body responding involuntarily to his proximity, to the dangerous game he was initiating. "I have needs, Bianca. Desires. And you have something I want." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a palpable electricity. What were those desires? How far was he willing to go? And how far was she willing to go to reclaim her life? "Tell me," she finally said, her voice a hushed challenge, her gaze locked on his. "What is it you really want, Matteo Greco?" The question hung in the air, the answer poised to redefine everything. Chapter 4. A Gilded Cage. Matteo's answer was not immediate. He studied Bianca, his dark eyes seeming to delve into the depths of her soul, assessing her strength, her resilience, her willingness to play the game he had initiated. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock, a constant reminder of the passage of time, of the dwindling options, of the life that was slipping away from her. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured, each word carefully chosen, like pieces in a complex and dangerous puzzle. "What I want," he said, "is more than just a repayment of your father's debt. That in itself is insignificant."
Bianca frowned, confused.
If the money wasn't the primary objective, then what was? What could this man, who seemingly had everything, possibly want from her? "I want," Matteo continued, his gaze intensifying, "to see if the fire I see in your eyes is real. If the defiance you show is more than just a facade. I want to see if you have the strength to survive in my world, Bianca. To thrive in it." His words were cryptic, yet they resonated with a strange truth. He wasn't interested in simply possessing her, in reducing her to a mere trophy. He wanted something more, something challenging. "And how do you propose to test that?" Bianca asked, her voice laced with a mixture of suspicion and a flicker of intrigue. Matteo smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that revealed a hint of something that might have been admiration. "By keeping you close," he said. "By immersing you in my life. By seeing how you react to the pressures, the dangers, the temptations." He reached out and gently took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was surprisingly warm, sending a jolt of unexpected electricity through her. He led her towards the massive double doors that led out of the ballroom, towards an unknown future. "Where are you taking me?" Bianca asked, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "To my home," Matteo replied. "To a place where you will be safe, protected, and observed." He opened the doors, revealing a long, dimly lit hallway. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of old wood and something else, something indefinable, a hint of power and secrets. As they walked, Bianca glanced around, taking in the details of the mansion. It was opulent, even more so than her family's home, but with a different aesthetic. Less ostentatious, more refined, with a sense of understated elegance that spoke of old money and established power. The walls were lined with portraits, the faces of generations of Grecos, their eyes seeming to follow her, judging her, assessing her worthiness. They reached another set of doors, even grander than the first, and Matteo opened them, revealing a vast, luxurious apartment. It was a breathtaking space, with high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city, and furnishings that were both modern and classic, a blend of comfort and sophistication. "This," Matteo said, his voice echoing slightly in the spacious room, "will be your home. For now." Bianca looked around, her mind reeling. It was a beautiful prison, a gilded cage, a place of both comfort and confinement. She was surrounded by luxury, but she was not free. She was a captive, a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand, a prisoner of a man who was both her captor and her potential savior. "And what will be expected of me?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of defiance. Matteo turned to her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You will be expected to adapt," he said. "To learn. To participate." He walked towards a large, ornate desk that stood near the windows, overlooking the city. He picked up a small, antique box, intricately carved and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. He opened it, revealing a single, stunning diamond necklace. "This," he said, holding it up so that the diamonds caught the light, "belonged to my mother. It is a symbol of status, of belonging." He walked back to Bianca and fastened the necklace around her neck. The diamonds felt cold against her skin, a heavy weight, a constant reminder of her new reality. "Wear it," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Let it be a reminder of your new position, of the choices you have made, and of the opportunities that lie ahead." The diamonds sparkled, beautiful and cold. They reflected the city lights, a myriad of twinkling promises and hidden dangers. What opportunities? What choices? She was at his mercy, living under his roof, wearing his mother's jewels. She was a bird in a gilded cage, but the cage was vast, and she could sense, perhaps, the door was not entirely locked. A new life was beginning, and she did not yet know if it would be her salvation or her utter ruin. The necklace felt heavy around her neck, a constant reminder of the precariousness of her situation and the unfathomable depths of the man who now controlled her fate. What game was he playing, and could she possibly win? Chapter 5. Echoes of a Lost Life. The first few days in Matteo's opulent apartment were a disorienting blend of luxury and isolation. Bianca found herself wandering through the vast rooms, feeling like a ghost in a museum, surrounded by beauty, but unable to truly touch or connect with anything. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hum of the city below and the muted sounds of the household staff, who moved around her with a quiet efficiency, their eyes carefully averted, their presence a constant reminder of her captive status. She spent hours staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights twinkle like distant stars, feeling a profound sense of loss for the life she had left behind. The memories of her family, of the laughter and warmth of their home, of the carefree days before the collapse, now seemed like fragments of a dream, distant and unattainable. She thought of her father, her heart aching with a mixture of anger and grief. How could he have done this to her? How could he have sacrificed her future, her happiness, to save himself? The betrayal cut deep, a wound that refused to heal. She thought of her mother and brother, wondering how they were coping, where they were living, if they were safe. The guilt of being separated from them, of being unable to help them, gnawed at her. She longed to see them, to talk to them, to reassure them that she was all right, but she knew that was impossible. Mateo had made it clear that any contact with her family was forbidden, a condition of her arrangement. She tried to occupy herself, to find some semblance of normalcy in her strange, new existence. She explored the apartment, discovering hidden nooks and crannies, a library filled with leather-bound books, a music room with a grand piano that she longed to play, but didn't dare touch, a small, private balcony that offered a breathtaking view of the city's skyline. She read, losing herself in the pages of classic novels, trying to escape the reality of her situation. She sketched, her hand moving instinctively across the paper, capturing the images that filled her mind, the faces of her loved ones, the scenes of her past, the emotions that swirled within her. But nothing could truly fill the void, the emptiness that gnawed at her. She was a prisoner of her circumstances, a captive of a man who held her fate in his hands. Mateo was a constant, enigmatic presence in her life. He was often absent, disappearing for hours, sometimes days, on business she could only guess at. But when he was there, his presence filled the apartment, a palpable force that both intimidated and intrigued her. He treated her with a strange mixture of courtesy and detachment. He provided her with everything she could possibly need, clothes, jewelry, books, even a personal chef who prepared elaborate meals that she often ate alone, feeling like a princess in a fairy tale, a princess who is also a prisoner. He engaged her in conversation, asking her about her life, her interests, her opinions. He seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, in her perspective, but he never revealed anything about himself, about his own past, his own feelings. He remained a closed book, a mystery she couldn't solve. Their interactions were always charged with an undercurrent of tension, a subtle dance of power and defiance. Bianca found herself constantly testing him, pushing the boundaries of her confinement, trying to gauge his reactions, to understand the limits of his control. One evening, she found him in the library, standing by the window, looking out at the city. He was dressed in a dark suit, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he had just returned from a long and difficult day. She hesitated for a moment, then walked towards him, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence, but she knew he was aware of her.
"What are you thinking about?"
she asked, her voice soft, breaking the silence. He turned slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I'm thinking," he said, his voice a low rumble, "about the complexities of life, about the choices we make and the consequences we face." His words resonated with her, echoing her own thoughts, her own struggles. She took a step closer, drawn to him by an invisible force, a connection she couldn't explain. "Do you ever regret your choices?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. A flicker of something that might have been pain crossed his face. He looked away, back towards the city, his gaze fixed on the distant lights. "Regret is a useless emotion, Bianca," he said. "It changes nothing. It only serves to weaken you. But doesn't everyone have regrets?" She persisted. "Things they wish they had done differently?" He turned back to her, his eyes intense, searching.
"Perhaps," he said.
"But I don't dwell on them. I focus on the present, on the future, on what I can control." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite define. "And what is it you control, Mateo?" she asked, her voice trembling, her heart pounding against her ribs. His lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. "I control my destiny, Bianca," he said. "And, for now, I control yours." The smile faded, and in that instant, she saw the shadow of something flicker in his eyes. A memory.
A pain.
Something he kept hidden, locked away deep within himself. The fleeting glimpse was gone as quickly as it appeared, the mask of control firmly back in place. But she had seen it, and it made her wonder, what ghosts haunted Matteo Greco? What were the echoes of his lost life? The question lingered, unanswered, a new thread in the complex tapestry of their intertwined fates. Chapter 6. The Serpent's Charm. The following weeks settled into a strange, unsettling rhythm. Bianca continued to navigate the labyrinthine world of Matteo's apartment, her days a mixture of gilded captivity and subtle rebellion. She was a bird in a luxurious cage, but she was beginning to test the strength of the bars, to explore the limits of her confinement, to search for a way to regain some semblance of control over her own life. Matteo remained an enigma, a constant presence that both fascinated and frightened her. He was a master of manipulation, a skilled player in a game she was only beginning to understand. He could be charming, attentive, even gentle one moment and cold, distant and utterly ruthless the next. She never knew which version of him she would encounter, which made their interactions a constant, tense dance of power and resistance. He continued to shower her with gifts, extravagant jewelry, designer clothes, rare books, anything she seemed to show even the slightest interest in. It was a form of seduction, a way of binding her to him, of reminding her of her dependence on him. But Bianca refused to be completely swayed. She accepted the gifts with a polite, but distant, gratitude, careful not to show any sign of weakness, any indication that she was succumbing to his charm. He often invited her to join him for dinner, elaborate meals prepared by his personal chef, served in the grand dining room, with its crystal chandelier and its long, polished table. These dinners were a performance, a carefully orchestrated display of power and control. Matteo would engage her in conversation, asking her about her day, her thoughts, her opinions, but the underlying message was always clear. He was in charge, and she was at his mercy. One evening, he surprised her by suggesting they go out. Bianca was initially hesitant, unsure of his motives, suspicious of his sudden generosity. But the thought of escaping the confines of the apartment, of breathing fresh air, of seeing something other than the same four walls, was too tempting to resist. He took her to a small, exclusive Italian restaurant, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was a place frequented by those who appreciated discretion, a place where secrets were whispered and deals were made. The atmosphere was intimate, with soft lighting, candlelit tables, and the murmur of quiet conversation. As they were seated, Bianca noticed the way the other patrons glanced at them, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and respect. They recognized Matteo. Of course. He was a man who commanded attention, a man who exuded power and influence. But they also looked at Bianca, their gazes lingering on her, assessing her, trying to understand her role in his life. Matteo ordered for both of them, choosing dishes she had never tried before, exotic flavors and textures that were both intriguing and slightly intimidating. He watched her as she ate, his eyes filled with a mixture of amusement and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. "Do you enjoy it?" he asked, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. "It's different," Bianca replied, carefully choosing her words. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing that he had impressed her, that he had managed to break through her carefully constructed defenses. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that revealed a hint of something predatory. "Different can be good, Bianca," he said. "It can open your eyes to new possibilities, new experiences." His words were laden with meaning, a subtle reminder of the bargain he had offered her, of the choices she had yet to make. As the evening progressed, Bianca found herself relaxing, slightly, in his presence. He was charming, witty, even entertaining. He told her stories about his travels, about his business dealings, about the people he had met. He spoke with a passion and an intensity that was captivating, drawing her into his world, making her forget, for a moment, that she was his captive. But then, something would happen, a subtle shift in his demeanor, a flicker of darkness in his eyes, a reminder of the power he held over her, and the spell would be broken. She would remember who she was, who he was, and the precariousness of her situation. As they were leaving the restaurant, a man approached them, his face familiar, a man Bianca recognized from her father's circle. He greeted Matteo with deference, his eyes flickering towards Bianca with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something that made her skin crawl. Don Greco, the man said, his voice smooth and oily. It's good to see you. And who is this lovely creature? Matteo's arm tightened around Bianca's waist, a possessive gesture that sent a jolt of both anger and a strange, unsettling thrill through her. This, he said, his voice cold and hard, is Bianca Vitali. She is with me. The man's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of understanding, of recognition, crossing his face. He knew what that meant. He knew the implications of Matteo's words. Ah, he said, his voice regaining its smoothness. I see. My apologies, Don Greco. I didn't realize. He bowed slightly and retreated, leaving Bianca and Matteo alone. Bianca felt a surge of anger, a resentment at being treated like a possession, a piece of property to be claimed and displayed. But she also felt a strange, undeniable sense of safety, of protection, in Matteo's presence. He was a dangerous man, a serpent with a deadly charm, but he was also her shield, her protector, in this treacherous world. As they walked back to the car, Bianca couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn deeper and deeper into his web, that she was losing herself in his world, that she was becoming something she didn't recognize. Back in the silent car, Bianca turned to him. Why did you bring me here?
What was the point of that display?
Matteo met her questioning gaze. His face was unreadable in the dim light, the shadows playing across his features. To remind you, Bianca, he said softly, his voice like velvet, and to remind them of where you stand.
Of who you are with.
The words, spoken with such quiet certainty, sent a chill down her spine. He had marked her.
Publicly.
She was his. And everyone knew it.
But why?
Was it a simple power play, or was there something more, something deeper, lurking beneath the surface of his carefully constructed facade? The question lingered, unanswered, a seed of unease planted firmly in her mind. Chapter 7. Beneath the Surface. The encounter at the restaurant had stirred something within Bianca, a disquiet that lingered long after they returned to the silent sanctuary of Matteo's apartment. She found herself increasingly preoccupied with understanding him, with peeling back the layers of his carefully constructed persona, with finding the man beneath the mask of power and control. She began to observe him more closely, paying attention to the subtle nuances of his behavior, the fleeting expressions that crossed his face, the unspoken words that hung in the air between them. She was searching for a crack in his armor, a glimpse of vulnerability, a hint of the humanity that she believed must exist beneath the surface. One afternoon, she found him in his study, a room she had previously avoided, sensing that it was his private domain, a place where he retreated to conduct his business, to plot his strategies, to be alone with his thoughts. But curiosity and a growing sense of boldness had driven her to seek him out. He was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out at the city. He was dressed casually, in a pair of dark jeans and a soft, cashmere sweater, a stark contrast to the tailored suits he usually wore. He looked younger, somehow more vulnerable, less like the formidable Don Greco, and more like a man. She hesitated for a moment, then knocked softly on the open door. He turned, his expression surprised, then quickly masked with his usual, impassive calm. Bianca, he said, his voice neutral, betraying no hint of his inner thoughts. What is it? I just wanted to talk, she said, her voice hesitant, unsure of how he would react to her intrusion. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes.
Talk, he said. About what?
She stepped into the room, her gaze taking in the details. It was a masculine space, with dark wood paneling, leather furniture, and shelves filled with books and various artifacts, each one seeming to hold a story, a secret. About you, she said, her voice gaining strength, her gaze meeting his directly. About who you really are. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, He gestured towards a pair of leather armchairs that were positioned near a fireplace, where a small fire crackled merrily, casting a warm glow over the room.
"Sit down, Bianca," he said.
"Let's talk." She sat down, feeling a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. This was a new step, a foray into uncharted territory. She was venturing into his world, and she didn't know what she would find. They talked for hours, or at least Bianca talked. Matteo listened, his gaze intense, his expression thoughtful. She told him about her childhood, about her family, about her dreams and aspirations, about the life she had lost. She spoke with a candor and an honesty that surprised even herself, revealing her vulnerabilities, her fears, her hopes. Matteo said little, but his silence was not dismissive. It was attentive, almost empathetic. He seemed to be genuinely interested in what she had to say, in understanding her perspective, in seeing the world through her eyes. As she spoke, she noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor. The hardness in his eyes softened, the lines of tension around his mouth relaxed. The mask of control seemed to slip, just slightly, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath. She told him about her passion for music, about how she had always dreamed of becoming a concert pianist, about how she had spent hours practicing, losing herself in the beauty of the melodies, finding solace and expression in the language of music. "Play for me," he said, his voice unexpectedly soft, his gaze holding hers.
Bianca hesitated.
She hadn't touched a piano since the night of the gala, since the collapse of her world. The thought of playing again, of opening herself up to the emotions that music evoked, was both terrifying and tempting. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "It's been a long time." "Please," he said, his voice a low murmur, his eyes filled with a plea that she couldn't resist. He led her to the music room, a space she had avoided, fearing the memories it would evoke. The grand piano stood in the center of the room, gleaming under the soft light, its keys waiting to be touched, to be brought back to life. Bianca sat down at the piano, her fingers trembling as she placed them on the keys. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions that raged within her. Then she began to play. She chose a piece by Chopin, a nocturne filled with longing and melancholy, a melody that spoke of loss and hope, of despair and resilience. The music flowed from her fingers, filling the room, weaving a tapestry of sound that expressed the emotions she couldn't put into words. As she played, she felt a sense of release, a catharsis, a letting go of the pain and the grief that had been bottled up inside her. She lost herself in the music, forgetting her surroundings, forgetting her captivity, forgetting everything but the beauty of the melody. When she finished, she sat in silence, her hands resting on the keys, her body trembling with the force of the emotions she had unleashed. She looked up at Matteo, who was standing by the piano, his eyes closed, his expression different. He opened his eyes, his gaze meeting hers. He didn't speak, but she saw something in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. It was a mixture of admiration, respect, and something else, something deeper, something that touched her heart. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "That was beautiful." He reached out and gently touched her hand, his fingers lingering on hers. The simple gesture, the warmth of his touch, sent a jolt of electricity through her. For the first time, it was not a gesture of power or possession, but an offering of empathy, a moment of shared connection, human to human. He was still a puzzle, his motives unclear, but for this brief sliver of time, the masks had fallen away. She had shown him a part of herself, and he, in turn, had offered a glimpse beneath his carefully constructed surface. Where would this new understanding lead? Would it forge a path to freedom, or simply lead her further into the labyrinth of his world? She didn't know, but for the first time, a flicker of hope, fragile but real, ignited within her. Chapter 8. Whispers of Rebellion. The shared moment at the piano had created a subtle shift in the dynamic between Bianca and Matteo. The air of formality that had previously characterized their interactions began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious, tentative understanding. It wasn't trust, not yet, But it was a step in that direction, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of their vastly different worlds. Bianca found herself feeling less like a prisoner and more like a guest, albeit a guest with very limited freedom. She began to assert herself more, to express her opinions, to challenge Matteo's assumptions, to subtly push the boundaries of her confinement. She started small, requesting specific books from the library, asking for certain dishes to be prepared, expressing a desire to spend time in the small, private garden that adjoined the apartment. Matteo, to her surprise, acquiesced to most of her requests, his eyes holding a flicker of amusement, as if he were enjoying her quiet acts of rebellion. One day, she decided to take a bigger risk. She had been longing to see her family, to know that they were safe, to reassure them that she was all right. She knew that direct contact was forbidden, but she hoped she could find a way to circumvent Matteo's restrictions. She waited until he was out of the apartment, knowing that he had a meeting with some of his associates, a meeting that would likely last for several hours. She then sought out Maria, one of the housekeepers, a woman who had shown her a quiet kindness, a subtle empathy that had not gone unnoticed. "Maria," Bianca said, her voice low and urgent, "I need your help." Maria looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and apprehension. She knew that helping Bianca could have serious consequences, that she was risking Matteo's wrath. But she also saw the desperation in Bianca's eyes, the longing for connection with her family. "What do you need, Signorina?" Maria asked, her voice hesitant. Bianca explained her plan, a simple request to make a phone call, a brief conversation with her mother, just to hear her voice, to know that she was all right. Maria hesitated for a moment, weighing the risks, then nodded her head. "I will help you," she said. "But we must be careful. We must not be discovered." Maria led her to a small, unused room at the back of the apartment, a room that was rarely used, a room where they were unlikely to be overheard. She handed Bianca a cell phone, a phone that was not connected to Matteo's network, a phone that could not be traced. Bianca dialed her mother's number, her heart pounding in her chest. The phone rang several times, and for a moment, she feared that her mother wouldn't answer. Then, she heard her mother's voice, filled with worry and relief.
"Bianca?"
Her mother said, her voice trembling. "Is that you? Are you all right?" Bianca felt a rush of emotion, tears welling up in her eyes. "Mama," she said, her voice choked with emotion.
"I'm all right."
"I'm safe. How are you? How is Leo?" They spoke for a few precious minutes, exchanging hurried words of love and reassurance. Bianca learned that her mother and brother were living in a small apartment, provided by one of her father's former associates, a man who had remained loyal to them, despite their downfall. They were struggling, but they were surviving. "Don't worry about me, Mama," Bianca said. "I'll find a way. I'll get through this." She hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of relief and renewed determination. She had heard her mother's voice, she had confirmed that they were safe, and she had reaffirmed her commitment to finding a way to reunite with them. She thanked Maria, her heart filled with gratitude for the woman's bravery and kindness. "You are a true friend, Maria," Bianca said. "I will never forget this." Maria smiled, a faint, sad smile that spoke of her own struggles, her own losses. "We must help each other, Signorina," she said. "That is the only way to survive in this world." When Matteo returned, Bianca was careful to conceal any trace of her transgression. She greeted him with a calm, composed demeanor, betraying no hint of the secret she held, of the small act of rebellion she had carried out. He seemed to sense a change in her, though. He studied her closely, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher the secrets she held. "You seem different," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Happier." Bianca met his gaze directly, her expression unwavering. "I am adapting," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I am learning to navigate my new reality." He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Indeed," he said, "you are proving to be more resourceful than I anticipated." He did not press her further, but she knew he was aware. He knew she had done something. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, a silent acknowledgement of the game they were playing, a game of cat and mouse, of power and resistance. She had taken a risk, a small step towards reclaiming her agency. Would he retaliate? Or would he, perhaps, admire her daring? She couldn't be sure, but the thrill of defiance, of having acted independently, gave her a newfound sense of strength. The seed of rebellion had taken root, and she knew it would continue to grow, fueled by her longing for freedom, for her family, for a life beyond the gilded cage. Chapter 9. The Price of Defiance. The subtle shift in Bianca's behavior, her quiet acts of rebellion, did not go unnoticed by Matteo. He was a man who prided himself on his control, on his ability to anticipate and manipulate the actions of those around him. He had expected Bianca to be compliant, to succumb to the weight of her circumstances, to accept her role as his collateral. But she was proving to be more resilient, more resourceful, more challenging than he had anticipated. He watched her closely, his eyes following her every move, his mind constantly analyzing her behavior, trying to decipher her motives, to understand the game she was playing. He knew she had contacted her family, despite his explicit prohibition. He had ways of monitoring her communications, of tracking her movements, of knowing everything that happened within the confines of his apartment. He could have confronted her immediately, punished her for her defiance, reminded her of her place.
But he chose not to.
He was intrigued by her boldness, by her willingness to risk his wrath. He saw a spark in her, a fire that he admired, a defiance that mirrored his own. He decided to play along, to let her think she was getting away with her small acts of rebellion, to see how far she would go, to test the limits of her courage. He wanted to see if she had the strength to truly challenge him, to stand up to him, to fight for her freedom. One evening, he invited her to join him for a drive. Bianca was hesitant, unsure of his motives, suspicious of his sudden generosity. But she also craved a change of scenery, a break from the confines of the apartment, a glimpse of the outside world. They drove in silence, the city lights blurring past the windows, the tension between them thick and palpable. Matteo drove with a quiet intensity, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes focused on the road ahead. He seemed to be lost in his own thoughts, preoccupied with some inner turmoil. Finally, he pulled the car over to the side of the road, in a secluded spot overlooking the city. The view was breathtaking, a panoramic vista of twinkling lights and towering skyscrapers. He turned to Bianca, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You contacted your family," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Bianca's heart skipped a beat. She had known he would find out, but she had hoped for more time, for a chance to prepare, to formulate a defense. She met his gaze directly, her chin lifted, her expression defiant. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I did." He studied her for a moment, his expression unchanged. "You disobeyed me," he said. "I needed to know they were safe," Bianca replied. "I needed to hear their voices." "And you were willing to risk my wrath?" he asked, his voice laced with a hint of something that might have been admiration. "I was," Bianca said. "My family is more important than your rules." A flicker of a smile crossed Matteo's lips. "Brave words, Bianca," he said. "But bravery can be foolish. It can have consequences." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling excitement. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling, her heart pounding against her ribs. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. "I could punish you," he said. "I could make you regret your defiance." But he paused, letting the word hang in the air, a tantalizing hint of a possibility, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had enveloped her. "But?" Bianca asked, her voice barely a whisper. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "But I admire your courage, Bianca," he said. "Your loyalty to your family. Your refusal to be broken." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He opened it, revealing a pair of diamond earrings, stunningly beautiful, exquisitely crafted. These, he said, holding them up so that the diamonds caught the light, were my grandmother's. She was a strong woman, a woman who defied convention, a woman who fought for what she believed in. He handed the box to Bianca. I want you to have them, he said, as a reminder that strength can be rewarded, that defiance can have unexpected consequences. Bianca stared at the earrings, her mind reeling. She was confused, disoriented. He had discovered her transgression, and instead of punishing her, he was rewarding her with a gift that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman he clearly admired. I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. Matteo smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that revealed nothing of his inner thoughts. Don't try to understand me, Bianca, he said. Just accept the gift. And continue to surprise me. He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, lingering kiss that was both a challenge and a promise. A taste of something forbidden, something dangerous. She didn't resist, her body responding involuntarily to his touch, the complex emotions he evoked. What game was he playing? Was this a reward, or a subtle form of manipulation? A way to bind her to him further? To deepen her dependence? She didn't know, but the earrings felt heavy in her hand, a tangible symbol of the precarious balance of power and the ever-shifting landscape of their relationship. The price of defiance, it seemed, was not always punishment. Sometimes it was something far more complicated. Chapter 10. Cracks in the Foundation. The gift of the earrings, and the unexpected kiss that accompanied it, marked a turning point in Bianca's relationship with Matteo. The lines between captor and captive, between debtor and creditor, became increasingly blurred, replaced by a complex web of emotions, of unspoken desires, of a dangerous attraction that neither of them could deny. Bianca found herself both drawn to and repelled by Matteo, fascinated by his power and his intelligence, yet wary of his ruthlessness and his control. She was playing a dangerous game, walking a tightrope between defiance and submission, between fear and something else, something she didn't dare name. She continued to test him, to push the boundaries of her confinement, to assert her independence, but she did so with a new awareness, a heightened sense of caution. She knew that he was watching her, that he was constantly assessing her, that he was waiting for her to make a mistake. One evening, she discovered a hidden room in the apartment, a small, locked room that she had never noticed before. Curiosity and a growing sense of adventure compelled her to find a way to open it. She searched for a key, exploring drawers and cabinets, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. Finally, she found it, a small, antique key hidden in a box of old letters, tucked away in a drawer in Matteo's study. She knew she was taking a risk, that she was venturing into forbidden territory, but she couldn't resist the urge to uncover the secrets that lay hidden within. She waited until Matteo was out of the apartment, knowing that he had a meeting with some of his associates. She then returned to the locked room, her hands trembling as she inserted the key into the lock. The key turned, the door clicked open, and she stepped inside. The room was small and dimly lit, filled with dust and cobwebs. It was a storage room, filled with old furniture, paintings, and various artifacts, each one seeming to hold a story, a secret. She began to explore, her eyes scanning the contents of the room, searching for something, anything, that would shed light on Matteo's past, on the secrets he kept hidden. She found a box of old photographs, faded images of a younger Matteo, a Matteo who looked different, softer, less guarded. She saw pictures of him with his family, his parents, his siblings, a family that seemed happy, normal, a stark contrast to the cold, controlled man he had become. She found a collection of letters, handwritten letters, tied together with a ribbon. She hesitated for a moment, knowing that she was crossing a line, that she was invading his privacy, but her curiosity overcame her. She untied the ribbon and began to read. The letters were from a woman named Isabella. They were love letters, filled with passion and longing, with promises of a future together, a future that had never materialized. As Bianca read, she began to piece together a story of love and loss, of betrayal and heartbreak. Isabella had been Matteo's first love, the woman he had intended to marry, the woman who had been taken from him. The letters revealed that Isabella had been killed, murdered by a rival family, a family that had sought to weaken Matteo, to destroy his happiness, to crush his spirit. The pain and the grief that Matteo must have felt were palpable, echoing through the words on the page, reaching out to Bianca, touching her heart. She understood now. The darkness that she had sensed in him, the shadow that haunted his eyes, the reason for his ruthlessness, his control, his inability to trust. He had been wounded, deeply wounded, and he had built walls around his heart, walls that protected him from further pain, walls that prevented him from loving, from trusting, from living. As she was putting the letters back, she heard a noise behind her. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw Matteo standing in the doorway, his expression dark and furious. He had returned unexpectedly, and he had caught her red-handed, invading his privacy, uncovering his secrets, touching the raw wound of his past. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice cold and hard, his eyes blazing with anger. Bianca felt a surge of fear, but she also felt a sense of understanding, of empathy. She had seen his vulnerability, his pain, and she couldn't simply cower in fear. I was curious, she said, her voice trembling, but holding a flicker of defiance. "I wanted to understand you." "You had no right," he said, his voice laced with fury. "You invaded my privacy. You betrayed my trust." "I know," Bianca said, "but I needed to see. I need to understand the pain." His anger didn't dissipate. Instead, it transformed into a look of barely controlled rage. "Get out," he stated flatly. "Get out of this room, and go to your own." She backed away slowly, not breaking eye contact. "Matteo now," he repeated, each syllable filled with icy command. Bianca retreated, leaving the small room, leaving him with his ghosts, his memories, his pain. She had seen beneath the surface, but the glimpse had come at a cost. The foundation of their fragile truce had cracked. What would happen now? Had she pushed him too far? She had seen his vulnerability, but she had also ignited his fury. The consequences, she knew, were coming. Chapter 11. The Lion and the Lamb. The aftermath of Bianca's intrusion into Matteo's private sanctuary was a chilling silence. He retreated into himself, becoming even more distant and unapproachable than before. The tentative understanding that had begun to develop between them shattered, replaced by a cold, palpable tension. Bianca felt like she was walking on eggshells, every word, every action, carefully considered, fearing his wrath, his retribution. She tried to apologize, to explain her actions, to reach out to him, but he rebuffed her attempts. He treated her with a cool politeness, a formal courtesy that was more cutting than any outright anger. He was punishing her, not with physical force, but with emotional distance, with a withdrawal of the fragile connection that had begun to form between them. Bianca felt a profound sense of isolation, of loneliness. She had glimpsed the man beneath the mask, the wounded soul that lay hidden beneath the layers of power and control, and she had been drawn to him, to his pain, to his vulnerability. But now, he had retreated, closing himself off, rebuilding the walls around his heart. She spent her days wandering through the apartment, feeling like a ghost, a shadow, unseen, unheard. She longed for connection, for understanding, for a way to bridge the chasm that had opened up between them. One evening, she found him in the living room, standing by the window, looking out at the city. He was dressed in a dark suit, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he had just returned from a long and difficult day. She hesitated for a moment, then walked towards him, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence, but she knew he was aware of her. "Matteo," she said, her voice soft, breaking the silence. He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the city below, his body tense, unyielding. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I shouldn't have. I didn't mean to." He turned slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. He studied her for a moment, his expression cold, devoid of any emotion. You violated my privacy, Bianca, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any inflection. You betrayed my trust. I know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But I wanted to understand you. I wanted to see the real you. A flicker of something that might have been pain crossed his face. He looked away, back towards the city, his gaze fixed on the distant lights. There is no real me, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. There is only this. The man you see before you. That's not true, Bianca said, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a desperate need to reach him, to break through his defenses. I saw him. In the letters, in the photographs, I saw the man you used to be. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else, something that looked like despair. That man is dead, he said, his voice cold and hard. He died with Isabella. He doesn't have to be, Bianca said, her voice pleading. He can live again. You can heal. You can love again. He laughed, a harsh, bitter laugh that sent a chill down her spine. Love, he said. Love is a weakness, Bianca. A vulnerability that I cannot afford. It's not a weakness, Bianca said. It's a strength. It's what makes us human. It's what gives life meaning. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming her, his scent filling her senses. He reached out and gently cupped her face with his hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the harshness of his words. You are naive, Bianca, he said, his voice a low murmur. You still believe in fairy tales. You still believe in happy endings. I believe in hope, Bianca said, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his. I believe in the possibility of redemption. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear, his voice a low whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. There is no redemption for me, Bianca, he said. Only retribution. He released her and turned away, walking towards the door. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, his back to her. Don't try to save me, Bianca, he said, his voice filled with a profound sadness. You can't, and you'll only end up getting hurt. He left the room, leaving Bianca alone in the silence, her heart aching with a mixture of grief and a strange, unsettling hope. She had seen his pain, his vulnerability, and she refused to believe that he was beyond redemption. She was the lamb, walking willingly into the lion's den, but she believed, perhaps foolishly, that she could somehow tame the beast, that she could reach the wounded heart that lay hidden beneath his hardened exterior. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger, that she risked being consumed by his darkness, but she was determined to try. She had seen a flicker of something good, something human, in him, and she clung to that, like a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the darkness that surrounded them. Where this newfound resolve would lead, she couldn't be sure, but she knew she couldn't simply surrender. She had to fight, for him, and for herself. The lion and the lamb were locked in a dance, a dangerous, delicate dance, and the outcome was far from certain. Chapter 12. Stolen moments, hidden truths. Despite Mateo's warning, despite the chilling distance he maintained, Bianca refused to give up on him. She sensed a profound loneliness beneath his hardened exterior, a yearning for connection that mirrored her own. She was determined to find a way to bridge the gap between them, to rekindle the fragile spark of understanding that had flickered briefly before being extinguished by his fear and his pain. She began to seek him out, not with words of apology or pleas for forgiveness, but with quiet gestures of companionship. She would join him in the library, reading silently while he worked, her presence a subtle reminder that she was there, that she cared. She would leave small gifts for him, a favorite book, a rare blend of coffee, a sketch she had drawn of the city skyline, small tokens of her affection, her empathy. At first, he ignored her efforts, treating her with the same cold politeness, the same emotional distance. But gradually, she noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor. He would glance at her, a fleeting look of something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps longing. He would accept her gifts, a slight nod of acknowledgement, a barely perceptible softening of his features. One evening, She found him in the music room, standing by the piano, his fingers resting on the keys, but not playing. He was staring out the window, lost in thought, his expression clouded with sadness. She walked towards him, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence, but she knew he was aware of her. "It's a beautiful instrument," she said, her voice soft, breaking the silence. He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the city below, his body tense, unyielding. "You should play," she said. "You have a gift." He turned slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. He studied her for a moment, his expression different, softer, less guarded. "I haven't played in years," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Not since he didn't finish the sentence, but Bianca knew what he meant. Not since Isabella. Not since his world had been shattered, his heart broken. "Play for me," she said, her voice gentle, pleading. "Please." He hesitated for a moment, then, to her surprise, he sat down at the piano. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, as if gathering his courage, steeling himself against the emotions that the music would evoke. Then he began to play. He chose a piece she didn't recognize, a haunting melody filled with both sorrow and a strange, fragile beauty. It was a composition of his own, she realized, a musical expression of his pain, his grief, his longing. As he played, Bianca watched him, her heart aching for him. She saw the emotions flicker across his face, the sadness, the anger, the regret, the love that he had tried so hard to bury. The music filled the room, weaving a tapestry of sound that spoke of loss and hope, of despair and resilience. It was a raw, vulnerable expression of his soul, a glimpse into the hidden depths of his heart. When he finished, he sat in silence, his hands resting on the keys, his body trembling with the force of the emotions he had unleashed. He looked up at Bianca, his eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and something else, something that looked like gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Bianca stepped closer, reaching out and gently touching his hand. His skin was warm, his fingers strong and calloused. "It was beautiful," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "It was you." He didn't pull away, didn't retreat from her touch. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if seeking something, some answer, some solace. They stayed there for a long moment, locked in a silent embrace, a connection forged not through words, but through music, through shared emotion, through a mutual understanding of pain and loss. It was a stolen moment, a fleeting glimpse of a possible future, a future where healing was possible, where love could bloom again, where the walls around his heart could crumble. The moment was broken by a sharp, insistent ringing Matteo's cell phone. He pulled away, the mask of control quickly descending, the vulnerability replaced by his usual guarded expression. He answered the call, his voice instantly hardening, the brief moment of intimacy shattered. "Greco," he said curtly, his back to Bianca. A short pause. "When?" "I'll be there." He ended the call and turned back to her, the fleeting connection severed, the distance re-established. "I have to go," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Business." Bianca nodded, understanding. The underworld never slept. Its demands were relentless, its grip inescapable. He was leaving again, retreating back into his world of shadows and secrets, leaving her behind, alone with the echoes of his music and the fragile hope that, perhaps, one day, he would return, not just physically, but emotionally. The stolen moment was over, but it had revealed a hidden truth. The ice around his heart was not impenetrable. It could melt, but what would it take to thaw it completely? And would she be the one to do it? Chapter 13. A Dance with Danger. Matteo's sudden departure, the abrupt return to his world of shadows and secrets, left Bianca with a lingering sense of unease. The brief moment of connection they had shared, the vulnerability he had revealed through his music, had only deepened her concern for him, her awareness of the dangers he faced, the constant threat that hung over his life. She found herself increasingly preoccupied with his safety, with the risks he took, with the enemies he had made. She knew that his world was a treacherous one, a world of violence and betrayal, a world where life was cheap and loyalty was a fleeting commodity. She tried to distract herself, to occupy her mind with other things, but her thoughts kept returning to him, to his safety, to the precariousness of his existence. She worried about him, a feeling that was both unexpected and unsettling. She, his collateral, his captive, was worried about the well-being of her captor. Several days passed with no word from him. The silence was oppressive, amplifying her anxiety, fueling her fears. She paced the apartment, restless and agitated, unable to find any peace, any solace. Finally, one evening, he returned. He arrived late, his face pale and drawn, his clothes stained with something dark, something that looked suspiciously like blood. Bianca rushed to him, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes filled with concern. "Matteo," she said, her voice trembling. "What happened? Are you all right?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something that looked like surprise. He seemed surprised by her concern, by her display of affection. "I'm fine," he said, his voice hoarse, his words clipped. "It's nothing." But Bianca knew it wasn't nothing. She saw the pain in his eyes, the tension in his body, the blood on his clothes. "You're hurt," she said, reaching out to touch him, but he flinched away from her touch. "Don't," he said, his voice sharp. "Don't touch me." He walked past her, heading towards his study, his movements stiff and unsteady. Bianca followed him, her concern growing with each passing moment. "Matteo, please," she said, her voice pleading. "Let me help you." He stopped, his back to her, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He seemed to be struggling to maintain his composure, to hold on to the mask of control that he always wore. "There's nothing you can do," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Let me see," Bianca insisted, stepping closer. "Please." He hesitated for a moment, then, slowly, he turned to face her. He removed his jacket, revealing a blood-soaked shirt, a wound on his arm, a deep gash that was still bleeding. Bianca gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You need a doctor," she said, her voice filled with alarm. "No," he said, his voice firm. "No doctors. No hospitals." He knew that seeking medical attention would be too risky, that it would expose him to his enemies, that it would make him vulnerable. "But you'll bleed to death," Bianca said, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a weary resignation. "Then I'll bleed to death," he said. Bianca refused to accept that. She couldn't just stand by and watch him die. She had to do something. "I can help you," she said, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a desperate determination. "I know how I've seen it done before." She had grown up in a world where violence was commonplace, where injuries were often treated in secret, where doctors were avoided whenever possible. She had witnessed her father's men tending to their wounds, patching themselves up, surviving against the odds. Matteo studied her for a moment, his expression skeptical. "You?" he said. "You know how to treat a wound like this?" "Yes," Bianca said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "I do." Against his protests, she led him to the bathroom. She gathered supplies, towels, antiseptic, bandages, her hands moving with a surprising efficiency, a competence born of necessity. She cleaned the wound, her touch gentle but firm, her focus unwavering. He watched her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something else, something that looked like respect. He was surprised by her strength, her resourcefulness, her willingness to help him, despite everything. As she worked, their hands brushed, their eyes met, and a strange, undeniable intimacy developed between them. It was a moment of shared vulnerability, of mutual dependence, a moment that transcended their roles as captor and captive. She finished bandaging the wound, her hands lingering on his arm for a moment longer than necessary. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. It was a genuine expression of gratitude, stripped of his usual arrogance, his usual control. The moment was charged with unspoken emotion, a potent mixture of relief, gratitude, and a growing, undeniable attraction. They were dancing with danger, not just the external threat of his world, but the internal danger of their own feelings, the forbidden desire that simmered beneath the surface. What would happen now? Would this shared vulnerability bring them closer, or would it push them further apart? The answer, like their future, remained uncertain, hanging precariously in the balance. Chapter 14. The Unveiling of Secrets. The night Bianca tended to Matteo's wound marked another significant shift in their relationship. The act of caring for him, of seeing him vulnerable and in pain, had broken down another barrier between them. The gratitude he had expressed, so raw and unexpected, had touched her deeply, confirming her belief that beneath his hardened exterior lay a man capable of feeling, of caring, of loving. The following days were filled with a quiet intensity. Matteo, though still recovering, resumed his usual activities, his world of shadows and secrets. But he treated Bianca differently, with a newfound respect, a subtle tenderness that had been absent before. He was still guarded, still careful not to reveal too much, but the coldness, the emotional distance, had diminished. Bianca continued to navigate her strange, new existence, balancing her fear of Matteo with her growing affection for him, her desire for freedom with her increasing concern for his safety. She was walking a tightrope, caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. One afternoon, while Matteo was out, Bianca decided to explore the apartment further. She had been drawn to a particular room, a room that was always locked, a room that she suspected held more of Matteo's secrets, more of his past. It wasn't the hidden room where she had found the letters, but another, larger room, located at the end of a long corridor, a room that seemed to exude an aura of mystery and sadness. She had searched for the key before, but had been unable to find it. This time, however, she was determined. She searched Matteo's study, his bedroom, every possible hiding place, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. Finally, she found it, a small, ornate key, hidden inside a hollowed-out book on his desk, a book on Italian history, a book that seemed significant. She took the key, her hands trembling, and headed towards the locked room. She inserted the key into the lock, the mechanism clicking softly. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was large and dimly lit, the windows covered with heavy drapes, blocking out the sunlight. It was a library, but unlike the other library in the apartment, this one was filled not with books on law and business, but with books on art, history, and literature. The shelves were lined with ancient tomes, leather-bound volumes, and rare manuscripts. In the center of the room stood a large, antique desk, its surface covered with papers, photographs, and various objects, each one seeming to hold a story, a secret. Bianca began to explore, her eyes scanning the contents of the room, searching for clues, for answers, for a deeper understanding of the man who had become her captor, her protector, her obsession. She found more photographs, pictures of Matteo as a child, a young man with his family, with Isabella. She saw images of his mother, a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, a woman who clearly adored her son. She saw pictures of his father, a stern-looking man, but with a hint of pride in his eyes, a pride in his family, in his heritage. A particular photograph caught her eye. It was a picture of a young Matteo, standing with Isabella in the garden she had come to admire. Isabella was dressed in white, a simple, elegant dress that emphasized her beauty, her radiant smile. Matteo stood close, their arms intertwined, his eyes full of love and a deep happiness she hadn't witnessed in him. It was an era, clearly, of his life filled with lightness and hope before tragedy. On the desk, she found a journal, a leather-bound book with Matteo's initials embossed on the cover. She hesitated for a moment, knowing that she was crossing a line, that she was invading his most private thoughts, but her curiosity, her need to understand him, overcame her. She opened the journal and began to read. The entries were sporadic, spanning several years, a record of his thoughts, his feelings, his struggles. She read about his love for Isabella, his dreams for their future, his grief and his rage after her death, his descent into darkness, his vow for revenge. As she read, she began to understand the depth of his pain, the extent of his loss, the reasons for his ruthlessness, his control, his inability to trust. She saw the man beneath the mask, the wounded soul that lay hidden beneath the layers of power and control. She also discovered a secret that Matteo had kept hidden from everyone, a secret that shed new light on his past, on his actions, on his relationship with her. She learned that Matteo's father, Don Lorenzo Greco, had been involved in a long-standing feud with the Vitali family, a feud that had spanned generations, a feud that had been fueled by betrayal, by bloodshed, by a thirst for revenge. She learned that her own father, Don Alessandro Vitali, had been responsible, indirectly, for Isabella's death. He had ordered a hit on a rival family, a family that had been allied with the Grecos. Isabella had been caught in the crossfire, an innocent victim of a war she had nothing to do with. Bianca felt a wave of shock, of disbelief, of guilt. Her own father, the man she had loved and admired, had played a role in the tragedy that had shaped Matteo's life, that had driven him to become the man he was. And she realized, with a chilling certainty, that Matteo's pursuit of her, his claim on her as collateral, was not just about the money. It was about revenge. It was about making her father pay for his sins, about making her suffer for the loss he had inflicted on him. She closed the journal, her hands trembling, her mind reeling. The truth was a heavy burden, a weight that threatened to crush her. She had uncovered his secrets, but in doing so, she had also uncovered her own. The dark legacy of her family, the price of her father's actions. What would she do with this knowledge? How would it change her relationship with Matteo? She had thought she was beginning to understand him, but now, she realized, she had only scratched the surface. The secrets ran deeper. The web of their intertwined fates was far more complex than she had ever imagined. Chapter 15. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. The discovery of her father's indirect involvement in Isabella's death, and the realization that Matteo's pursuit of her was driven, at least in part, by revenge, hit Bianca like a physical blow. She felt a profound sense of betrayal, not just by her father, but by Matteo as well. She had begun to trust him, to care for him, to see beyond his hardened exterior, to believe in the possibility of a future together. But now, she saw that she had been naive, foolish, that she had allowed herself to be seduced by a serpent, a man who had used her, manipulated her, all for the sake of his own vendetta. She retreated to her room, her mind reeling, her heart aching with a mixture of anger, grief, and a strange, lingering sadness. She felt betrayed, used, manipulated, but she also felt a deep empathy for Matteo, for the pain he had suffered, for the loss that had driven him to become the man he was. She spent hours staring out the window, watching the city lights twinkle like distant stars, feeling lost and alone, adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. She didn't know what to do, who to trust, where to turn. She thought of her father, her heart aching with a mixture of anger and disappointment. How could he have done this? How could he have been responsible, even indirectly, for such a tragedy? The image she had of him, the strong, protective father, had been shattered, replaced by the image of a man capable of ruthless actions, of causing irreparable harm. She thought of Matteo, her feelings towards him a tangled mess of conflicting emotions. She was angry at him, hurt by his deception, but she also understood him, his pain, his motivations. She couldn't condone his actions, his desire for revenge, but she couldn't deny the connection she felt with him, the strange, undeniable attraction that had grown between them. As the night wore on, she realized that she couldn't simply remain silent, that she couldn't continue to live with this knowledge, this burden of secrets and lies. She had to confront Matteo. She had to tell him what she had learned. She had to face the consequences of her actions, of his actions, of her father's actions. She waited until she heard him return to the apartment. She waited until she heard him enter his study, the room where he retreated to deal with his business, to plot his strategies, to be alone with his thoughts. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation, preparing herself for the storm that was about to break. She walked towards a study, her footsteps resolute, her heart pounding in her chest. She knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping against the wood, a sharp, decisive sound that broke the silence. "Come in," he said, his voice gruff, betraying no hint of his inner thoughts. She opened the door and stepped inside. He was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out at the city. He was dressed in a dark suit, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he had just returned from a long and difficult meeting. He turned slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. He studied her for a moment, his expression wary, guarded. He sensed that something was different, that she was different. "Bianca," he said, his voice neutral, betraying no emotion. "What is it?" She met his gaze directly, her chin lifted, her expression resolute. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady, despite the turmoil that raged within her. He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something that might have been apprehension crossing his face. "About what?" he asked. "About Isabella," Bianca said, the name a sharp, painful word that hung in the air between them. "About my father. About us." His expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of fear, perhaps? Or was it guilt? "What about Isabella?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled, his guard firmly in place. Bianca took a deep breath, and then she told him. She told him everything she had learned, everything she had discovered in the locked room, everything she had read in his journal. She told him about her father's involvement in Isabella's death, about Matteo's vow for revenge, about her own realization that she had been a pawn in his game, a means to an end. As she spoke, she watched him, her eyes searching his, looking for a reaction, a sign of remorse, a flicker of humanity. But his expression remained unchanged, his mask of control firmly in place. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on hers, his eyes dark and unreadable. "So," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "You know." "Yes," Bianca said, her voice trembling.
"I know."
"And what do you intend to do with this knowledge?" he asked, his voice laced with a hint of challenge. Bianca met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness.
"I don't know," she said.
"I don't know what to do." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I thought I was starting to understand you,
To care for you."
But now he finally reacted, a flicker of pain crossing his features, a crack in his carefully constructed facade. "You were a means to an end, Bianca. Collateral. Nothing more." The words, spoken with such cold finality, were like a knife to her heart. Had everything been a lie? The stolen moments, the shared confidences, the growing tenderness, had it all been a calculated manipulation? A part of his plan for revenge? The realization was a bitter sting, a betrayal far deeper than she had imagined. Chapter 16. The Weight of Loyalty. Bianca recoiled from Matteo's words, the coldness of his confession striking her like a physical blow. The fragile hope that had begun to blossom within her, the belief that she could reach the man beneath the mask, withered and died, leaving behind a bitter residue of disappointment and despair. "So, everything was a lie?" she asked, her voice trembling, her eyes searching his, desperately seeking some sign of remorse, some flicker of humanity. "The music, the gifts, the kindness, it was all part of your plan?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the city lights below, his expression conflicted. He seemed to be struggling with himself, with the truth, with the consequences of his actions. Finally, he turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something else, something that looked like regret. "Not everything," he said, his voice hoarse, his words barely a whisper. "Not everything." Bianca felt a flicker of something, a spark of hope, perhaps, or was it just wishful thinking? She didn't know. She was too hurt, too confused, too betrayed to trust her own instincts. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion, her guard firmly in place. He stepped closer, reaching out to touch her, but she flinched away from his touch. He let his hand drop, his expression resigned. It means, he said, his voice low and strained, that things changed. That I changed.
How?
Bianca asked, her voice sharp, demanding an explanation, a justification for his actions. He hesitated for a moment, then he began to speak, his words slow and measured, as if he were choosing them carefully, weighing their impact. When I first took you, he said, you were just a means to an end. A way to hurt your father, to avenge Isabella's death. I saw you as an object, a pawn in my game. He paused, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that was almost palpable. But then he continued, his voice softening. I got to know you. I saw your strength, your resilience, your kindness. I saw the woman beneath the surface, the woman who had been hidden from the world, the woman who had been wronged. He looked away again, unable to meet her gaze, his shame evident in the slump of his shoulders, the tension in his body. I started to care for you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Against my will, against my better judgment, against everything I believed in. Bianca listened, her heart aching with a mixture of conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe him, she wanted to trust him, but she couldn't. He had lied to her, manipulated her, used her. He had broken her trust, and she didn't know if she could ever forgive him. But you still used me, she said, her voice filled with a quiet anger, a deep-seated resentment. You still kept me here, against my will. You still pretended. He nodded, his head bowed, accepting her accusation, acknowledging his guilt. Yes, he said. I did. I was afraid. Afraid of my feelings, afraid of losing control, afraid of letting go of my revenge. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a plea for understanding, for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. But I need you to know the truth. I need you to know that I'm not the man I used to be. You changed me, Bianca. You showed me that there is still good in the world, that there is still hope. Bianca didn't know what to say. She was torn, divided between her anger and her affection for him. She had seen his vulnerability, his pain, his capacity for love, but she had also seen his ruthlessness, his deception, his willingness to use her for his own ends. She felt a profound sense of loss, of disappointment. She had believed in him. She had believed in the possibility of a future together, but now she saw that it had all been a lie, a carefully constructed illusion. I need time, she said, her voice trembling. I need space. I need to think. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in his study, his secrets exposed, his heart laid bare. She retreated to her room, her sanctuary, her prison. She needed to process everything, to sort through her tangled emotions, to decide what to do, where to go, who to trust. She knew her loyalties were divided. To her family, tarnished as their legacy was, and to this man, this captor who had, against all odds, captured a piece of her heart. The weight of those loyalties, the conflicting demands, pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate her. What was the right choice? Was there even such a thing in this world of shadows and lies? The answer, she knew, would not come easily. Chapter 17. A Desperate Gambit. The days following Bianca's confrontation with Matteo were filled with a tense, uneasy silence. They avoided each other, their interactions limited to brief, formal exchanges, the air between them thick with unspoken emotions, with unresolved conflict. Bianca spent most of her time in her room, wrestling with her feelings, trying to make sense of the tangled web of betrayal and affection that bound her to Matteo. She was torn between her anger at his deception and her understanding of his pain, between her desire for freedom and her growing concern for his well-being. She knew that he was a dangerous man, a man capable of ruthless actions, but she had also seen his vulnerability, his capacity for love, his yearning for redemption. She considered her options, weighing the risks and the consequences of each possible course of action. She could try to escape, to return to her family, to seek refuge from the dangerous world she had been thrust into. But she knew that Matteo would never let her go easily, that he would pursue her, that he would stop at nothing to reclaim what he considered his. She could also choose to stay and continue fighting, to challenge him to be better. This would be the more dangerous choice, and perhaps foolish. But the faint glimmer of hope for their joined redemption, for a future where the darkness did not win, still sparked within her. One evening, she received a message. A cryptic note slipped under her door, a message from someone within Mateo's organization, someone who had witnessed her kindness, her strength, her refusal to be broken. The note warned her of an impending attack, a plot by a rival family to eliminate Mateo, to seize control of his empire. Bianca's heart pounded in her chest as she read the message. She knew that she had to act, that she had to warn Mateo, despite everything that had happened between them. She couldn't stand by and watch him be killed, even if he didn't deserve her help, even if he had betrayed her trust. She found him in his study, as usual, poring over documents, his face etched with worry, his eyes dark and troubled. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded, wary. "Bianca," he said, his voice neutral, betraying no emotion. "What is it?" She held out the note, her hand trembling slightly. "I received this," she said, her voice urgent. "You're in danger." He took the note and read it, his expression darkening, his jaw clenching with anger. He recognized the threat, the signature of his enemies, the boldness of their attack. "When?" he asked, his voice sharp, his mind already racing, formulating a plan, calculating his defenses. "Tonight," Bianca said. "They're planning to attack tonight." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, questioning her motives, her loyalty. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "After everything, why?" Bianca met his gaze directly, her chin lifted, her expression resolute. "Because I don't want you to die," she said, her voice firm, despite the turmoil that raged within her. "Because, despite everything, I care about you." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by a flicker of something else, something that looked like gratitude. He seemed to be caught off guard by her honesty, by her willingness to help him, despite his betrayal. "You shouldn't," he said, his voice low and strained. "I don't deserve it." "Perhaps not," Bianca said. "But that doesn't matter now. What matters is surviving this." He nodded, his mind already focused on the task ahead, on the battle that was about to begin. He started to issue orders, barking commands into his phone, mobilizing his men, preparing for the attack. Bianca watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. He was a warrior, a leader, a man who would fight to the death to protect his empire, his family, her. "I can help," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I know this place. I know the secret passages, the hidden rooms. I can guide you." He looked at her, his expression skeptical. "It's too dangerous," he said. "I can't risk your life." "You already have," Bianca said, her voice laced with a hint of bitterness. "And I'm not afraid. I want to help." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, his eyes filled with a newfound respect for her courage, for her loyalty. "All right," he said. "But you stay close to me. You do exactly as I say. Understand?" "Yes," Bianca said. "I understand." They moved quickly, preparing for the inevitable. She showed him the hidden passages, the secret routes through the mansion, the places where they could ambush their attackers. She was surprisingly calm, her mind focused, her instinct sharp. She was no longer just a pawn, but an active player. He gave her a small, discreet weapon, showing her how to use it. "Only if absolutely necessary," he instructed, his voice grave. "I don't want you hurt." The night was filled with tension, with the anticipation of violence, with the chilling awareness that their lives hung in the balance. It was a desperate gambit, a fight for survival, a test of their courage, their loyalty, their love. Would they survive? And if they did, what would remain of their shattered relationship? The answers, like the night itself, were shrouded in darkness and uncertainty. Chapter 18. Into the Lion's Denver. The attack came swiftly and brutally, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm Mateo's defenses and eliminate him once and for all. Gunfire erupted throughout the apartment, shattering the opulent silence, the echoes reverberating through the hallways, a symphony of violence and chaos. Bianca stayed close to Matteo, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses heightened, her body tense and alert. She followed his instructions, moving swiftly and silently through the secret passages, using her knowledge of the apartment to their advantage, guiding him through the labyrinthine corridors, avoiding the main areas of conflict. They encountered pockets of resistance, groups of armed men loyal to their rival family, their faces masked, their eyes filled with a cold, ruthless determination. Matteo dispatched them quickly and efficiently, his movements precise and deadly, his years of experience evident in every action. He was a warrior, a predator, fighting for his survival, protecting his territory, her. Bianca, despite her fear, remained calm and focused, her instincts guiding her, her resolve strengthened by her desire to help Matteo, to protect him, to survive this night together. She used the weapon he had given her, firing it only when necessary, her aim surprisingly accurate, her hand steady. They moved through the apartment like shadows, a team, a unit, bound together by a shared purpose, by a mutual need to survive. They communicated with brief, coded words, with glances, with touches, a silent understanding passing between them, a connection forged in the crucible of violence. At one point, they were separated, caught in a crossfire, forced to take cover in different rooms. Bianca found herself alone, facing a group of armed men, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She fought back, using her wits, her agility, her newfound skills, to evade their attacks, to defend herself. She managed to escape, finding her way back to Matteo, her body bruised and battered, but her spirit unbroken. He was relieved to see her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and pride. He had underestimated her. He realized her strength, her courage, her resilience. They continued to fight their way through the apartment, working together, protecting each other, their bond strengthening with each passing moment, with each shared danger. Finally, they reached the main control room, the heart of Matteo's security system, the place where they could monitor the attack, coordinate their defenses, and call for reinforcements. Matteo quickly assessed the situation, analyzing the movements of their attackers, identifying their weaknesses, formulating a plan to counter their assault. He was a master strategist, a brilliant tactician, his mind sharp and focused, despite the chaos that surrounded them. He turned to Bianca, his eyes filled with a newfound respect, a genuine appreciation for her courage, her loyalty, her love. "You saved my life," he said, his voice low and sincere. "You risked everything for me." Bianca met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "We saved each other," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out and gently touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. It was a moment of tenderness, a brief respite from the violence, a recognition of the bond that had formed between them, a bond forged in the fires of adversity. "I was wrong about you, Bianca," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You're not just collateral. You're so much more." Before she could respond, the door to the control room burst open, and a group of armed men stormed inside, led by a figure Bianca recognized, a man from her father's past, a man who had always been envious of Matteo's power, a man who had orchestrated this attack. "It's over, Greco," the man said, his voice filled with a cold, triumphant glee. "You're finished." Matteo stood his ground, facing his enemy, his body tense and ready, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. Bianca stood beside him, her hand gripping her weapon, her heart pounding, her resolve unwavering. They were cornered, outnumbered, outgunned. It was a final stand, a last desperate attempt to survive. They were in the lion's den, facing their ultimate test. Would they emerge victorious, or would this be their final hour? Chapter 19. The Reckoning. The scene in the control room was a tableau of tension and impending violence. Matteo and Bianca stood side by side, facing their adversaries, their bodies tense, their eyes locked in a silent communication, a shared understanding of the desperate situation they were in. The air crackled with electricity, with the anticipation of a final, brutal confrontation. The leader of the attacking force, a man named Sal DeMarco, stepped forward, his face twisted with a mixture of hatred and triumph. He was a man driven by envy, by a thirst for power, by a long-standing grudge against Matteo, against the Greco family. "I've waited a long time for this, Greco," DeMarco said, his voice dripping with venom. "I've waited a long time to see you fall." Matteo didn't respond, his gaze fixed on DeMarco, his expression cold and unyielding. He was assessing his enemy, calculating his chances, searching for a weakness, a way to turn the tables, to survive this seemingly impossible situation. "You should have stayed down," DeMarco continued, his voice rising in anger. "You should have accepted your defeat. But you were too proud, too arrogant. And now you're going to pay the price." He gestured to his men, a signal to attack, to finish off Matteo and Bianca, to seize control of the Greco Empire. But before they could move, Bianca stepped forward, her voice ringing out clear and strong, defying the threat, challenging DeMarco, surprising everyone in the room, including Matteo. "You think you've won?" she said, her voice laced with contempt. "You think you can just take what's not yours? You think you can kill us and get away with it?" DeMarco laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Look at you," he said, his eyes filled with derision. "The little Vitali princess. Playing the hero. You're nothing. You're just a pawn in this game." "I may have been a pawn," Bianca said, her voice gaining strength, her eyes flashing with defiance. "But I'm not anymore. I'm standing here with Matteo, and we're not going to let you win." She raised her weapon, her hand steady, her aim true. She was no longer the frightened, naive girl who had been thrust into this world of violence and betrayal. She was a warrior, a survivor, a woman who had found her strength, her courage, her voice. DeMarco's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He had underestimated her, he realized, her spirit, her resolve, her connection to Matteo. Before he could react, Matteo moved, swiftly and decisively. He disarmed DeMarco with a single, fluid motion, his years of experience, his training, his instincts kicking in. He then engaged the other men, fighting with a ferocity and a skill that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Bianca joined the fight, her movements surprisingly agile, her aim accurate. She fought alongside Matteo, protecting him, defending him, their actions synchronized, their bodies moving in a deadly dance of survival. The control room erupted in chaos, a whirlwind of gunfire, shouts, and the sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor. Matteo and Bianca fought back to back, a united force, their bond strengthened by the shared danger, by the mutual need to survive. One by one, DeMarco's men fell, until only DeMarco himself remained, disarmed and defeated, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. He had lost. His plan had failed. His ambition had been crushed. Matteo stood over him, his weapon pointed at DeMarco's head, his eyes filled with a cold, hard fury. He had the power to end it, to kill DeMarco, to take his revenge. But he hesitated. He looked at Bianca, his eyes searching hers, seeking her guidance, her approval, her forgiveness. He had vowed revenge. He had lived for revenge. But now, in this moment of reckoning, he found himself questioning his own actions, his own motives, his own heart. Bianca met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and compassion. She saw the conflict within him, the struggle between his desire for vengeance and his growing capacity for mercy. She shook her head, slightly, a silent plea, a gentle reminder of the man she believed he could be, the man she had glimpsed beneath the mask of power and control. Matteo lowered his weapon, his hand trembling slightly. He couldn't do it. He couldn't kill DeMarco in cold blood. He couldn't stoop to his level. He couldn't let his past, his pain, define him any longer. "Get out," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Get out of my sight." and never come back. He spared DeMarco's life, choosing mercy over vengeance, choosing a different path, a path that Bianca had shown him, a path that led to redemption. DeMarco, stunned and defeated, scrambled to his feet and fled, disappearing into the night, his dreams of power shattered, his ambition turned to ashes. The reckoning was over. The battle had been won. But the war, the internal war within Matteo, was just beginning. Chapter 20. Redemption's Embrace. The aftermath of the attack was a period of quiet reflection and profound change. The physical damage to the apartment was extensive, but the emotional damage, the scars left by the violence and betrayal, ran far deeper. Matteo and Bianca emerged from the crucible of that night transformed, their relationship redefined, their futures uncertain, but intertwined in a way that neither of them could have anticipated. Matteo, having spared DeMarco's life, had taken the first step on a long and difficult path towards redemption. He began to dismantle the empire of violence and fear that his father had built, seeking to legitimize his business dealings, to distance himself from the criminal underworld, to create a new legacy, a legacy of peace. It was a slow and arduous process, fraught with challenges and resistance. He faced opposition from within his own organization, from those who clung to the old ways, from those who saw his change of heart as a weakness, a betrayal of their traditions. He also faced skepticism from the outside world, from law enforcement, from the legitimate business community, from those who doubted his sincerity, who believed that a leopard could never change its spots. But Matteo persevered, driven by a newfound sense of purpose, by a desire to atone for his past, by a commitment to building a better future, a future with Bianca. Bianca, for her part, struggled to reconcile her feelings for Matteo with the knowledge of his past, with the pain he had caused her, with the betrayal she had endured. She had forgiven him, in her heart, but she couldn't forget. She needed time, space, to heal, to rebuild her trust, to decide if a future with him was truly possible. She moved out of the apartment, finding a small place of her own, a sanctuary where she could reflect, where she could rediscover herself, where she could begin to rebuild her life. She reconnected with her mother and brother, providing them with support, with comfort, with a renewed sense of family. Matteo respected her decision, giving her the space she needed, the time to heal. He visited her often, bringing her gifts, small tokens of his affection, his remorse, his love. He didn't pressure her. He didn't demand anything from her. He simply waited. He proved his commitment to change through his actions. He cooperated with the authorities, providing information that helped to dismantle criminal networks, to bring down corrupt officials, to expose the dark underbelly of the city. He used his wealth and influence to support charitable causes, to help those in need, to give back to the community he had once exploited. He also sought therapy, confronting his demons, his pain, his past, with the help of a professional. He began to understand the root causes of his anger, his violence, his need for control. He began to heal, to forgive himself, to find peace. One evening, several months after the attack, Matteo invited Bianca to meet him at the small, private garden that adjoined his apartment, the place where they had shared stolen moments, the place where he had played his music for her, the place where he had revealed a glimpse of his soul. Bianca hesitated, unsure of his motives, uncertain of her own feelings. But she agreed to meet him, drawn to him by an invisible force, a connection that she couldn't deny, a hope that she couldn't quite extinguish. She found him waiting for her, standing amidst the flowers, his face softened, his eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and love. He looked different, younger, less burdened, more at peace. He smiled as she approached, a genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that touched her heart. "Bianca," he said, his voice soft, filled with emotion. "Thank you for coming." "Matteo," she said, her voice hesitant, her heart pounding in her chest. They stood in silence for a moment, looking at each other, their eyes communicating 1,000 unspoken words, 1,000 shared emotions. "I know I don't deserve you," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I know I've hurt you, betrayed you, broken your trust. But I've changed, Bianca." I'm not the man I used to be. He stepped closer, reaching out and gently taking her hand. His touch was warm, familiar, sending a shiver down her spine. I love you, Bianca, he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that she couldn't doubt. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life making it up to you, proving to you that I can be the man you deserve. Bianca's eyes filled with tears, tears of relief, of joy, of forgiveness. She had waited so long to hear those words, to feel this connection, to believe in the possibility of a future with him. I love you too, Matteo, she said, her voice trembling with emotion.
I know you've changed.
I see it in your eyes, in your actions, in your heart. He pulled her close, embracing her, holding her tight, as if he would never let her go. They stood there, in the quiet sanctuary of the garden, surrounded by the beauty of the flowers, bathed in the soft glow of the evening light. It was a moment of redemption, a moment of healing, a moment of love. They had found their way back to each other, through the darkness, through the pain, through the betrayal. They had embraced their second chance, their opportunity to build a new life, a life free from the shadows of the past, a life filled with hope, with peace, with love. The embrace was a promise, a commitment to a future together, a future built on trust, respect, and a love that had survived the ultimate test. Redemption had found them, and they had welcomed it with open arms. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the transformative power of love and forgiveness. Bianca and Matteo built a life together, a life far removed from the violence and shadows of their past. They moved away from New York, settling in a quiet, secluded villa in the Italian countryside, surrounded by rolling hills, vineyards, and the serene beauty of nature. Matteo continued his work, using his wealth and influence for good, supporting charitable causes, promoting peace, and advocating for justice. He became the respected member of the community, a philanthropist, a man known for his generosity, his compassion, and his commitment to making a positive impact on the world. Bianca, for her part, rediscovered her passion for music. She became a renowned pianist, performing concerts around the world, her melodies captivating audiences, her artistry touching hearts. She used her music to heal, to inspire, to bring joy to others. They had children, a son and a daughter, who grew up surrounded by love, by beauty, by a sense of peace and security that their parents had never known. They taught their children the importance of forgiveness, of compassion, of choosing love over hate, of building a better world. Their home became a sanctuary, a place of refuge, a place where family and friends gathered, where laughter and love filled the air, where the ghosts of the past were finally laid to rest. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the Tuscan landscape, Bianca and Matteo sat together on the terrace of their villa, their hands intertwined, their hearts filled with a quiet contentment. They had been through so much. They had overcome so many obstacles. They had survived the darkness and emerged into the light. Bianca looked at Matteo, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. She saw the man he had become, the man he had always been capable of being, the man she had helped him to find. We did it, she said, her voice soft, filled with emotion. We found our way. Matteo smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that spoke of a deep and abiding love. We did, he said, his voice filled with a quiet joy. Together. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that spoke of a love that had endured, a love that had conquered all, a love that had redeemed them both. They sat there, in silence, watching the sunset, their hands clasped together, their hearts united, their souls at peace. They had found their happy ending, not in a fairy tale, but in the real world, a world they had shaped with their own hands, a world they had filled with love, with forgiveness, with redemption. The past was behind them, a distant memory, a lesson learned. The future stretched before them, bright and full of promise. And they would face it together always. The end.